got you now. It's looking good, over.
Roger, copy.
Eagle Houston, after yaw around angles, S-band pitch, -9er, yaw, +18. Roger, you're a go to continue power descent. You're a go to continue power descent.
Altitude now 21,000 feet, still looking very good. Velocity down now to 1,200 feet per second.
You're looking great to us, Eagle.
Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm.
Roger, we got you. We're going at alarm.
Good radar data. We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Altitude 4,200.
Houston, you're a go for landing, over.
Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Program alarm.
Altitude 1,600. 1,400 feet, still looking very good.
700 feet, 21 down. 33 degrees. 100 feet, down at 19. 1201. 1201.
Roger, 1201 alarm. We're go, same type, we're go.
Altitude, velocity, light. 8.5 down. 220 feet. 13 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely. 200 feet. 4.5 down. 5.5 down.
60 seconds.
Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. That's 40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drifting to the right a little. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
TV. There's a great deal of contrast in it, and currently it's upside down on our monitor, but we can make out a fair amount of detail. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder and
Step off the limb now. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
All that we have accomplished in space, all that we may accomplish in days and years to come, we stand ready to share for the benefit of all mankind.
As we explore the reaches of space, let us go to the new worlds together, not as new worlds to be conquered, but as a new adventure to be shared.
Hello, my name's Ross Marshall, and I'm your host for this show today. I guess you're wondering what this video's about, and you're fixing to find out what this video's about. The subject is, did we go to the moon? Did man land on the moon, as the U.S. government has claimed we have, in the Apollo programs? There are other questions which will arise as to whether we even can get a satellite outside the atmosphere, let alone a spacecraft, supposedly made of a tin can, plastic and aluminum, with 3 guys in it, landing on a void vacuum, running around in a rover, etc., etc. Well, this all started back a while, years ago, with me, and this is why I've made this documentary, and we'll continue to make documentaries on weird subjects. I love weird subjects. Years ago I started researching, reading a lot, studying. One of the first things I got into was a guy by the name of Churchward, James Churchward, Lost Continent of Mu, capital M-U, Mu. Has nothing to do with a cow. But it was a very good book. Then I found another and another. And this led me into ancient history. Real ancient history. More or less pre-historical history, history before man's written history began. Well, of course, this led me to study Atlantis, between Churchward's lost continent in the Pacific called Lemuria by some, and the lost continent of Atlantis. These have been the two oldest subjects that I've studied. They date back 25 years, possibly 30, I'm not sure. Well, the more I studied, the more I found out that history always has two sides. As they say, only the victor writes the history, not the loser. Well, in history, political events, when you have conflicts between interests, you always have a lot of truth. There's a lot of truth on both sides. Yet you have your propaganda. A fine example of that would be your Nazi German propaganda. Now, if you predate to propaganda, when everything was peaceful and Germany was building its economy and stuff, there was a little propaganda floating around. They were boasting how wonderful they were doing and stuff, but primarily real history was being written. Hitler was coming to power slowly, and economics was getting better for him. But then the war started. Then the propaganda started. Not only on the German side, but in a lot of newsreels and a lot of United States government documentaries and educational films, you'll find a little propaganda, a little sensationalizing. Well, as I went to college, studied, spent 10 years in college and university, studied ancient history, changed majors 3 or 4 times. College can be interesting. You're interested in a major 1 minute, forget it, dump it, follow another one. So I went into art, studied art, but I always went back to ancient history. That's my first love. Well, as I moved into the sciences, I became interested in, metaphysics, cosmology, theology, and then astronomy. When you look up in the sky at night, let your mind wander really deep. Sometimes you get to thinking, what's this all about? Is there anybody else out there? Well, as the years rolled on, the same question presented over and over. I studied astronomy, astrophysics. Then one day I ran across some people talking about conspiracies. I started studying under these people. I mean, hardcore conspiratorial theorists. Just about everything they dug up was a conspiracy. Well, I studied that for many years. Many of them are conspiracies. Everybody knows about the JFK assassination. John Kennedy's going along, talks about changing things a little too much. A lot of things we don't know about. All of a sudden, bang. A little while later, his brother, Robert, bang. Well, if you go back before that, the other historical periods, got Lincoln, bang. After JFK, you got, well, move ahead a little further and go to Idaho or up there Midwest, northern Midwest. You got the Randy Weaver situation. It's just now coming out after 5 years. And then 60 Minutes had a program on it. And then you got Waco. What the devil went on at Waco? And then you got the federal building in Oklahoma being bombed. Wow. Everybody's got a conspiratorial view. No, these people did it. No, they did it. No, the U.S. government did it. No, the Russians did it. No, the communists did it. Everybody blames everybody else. After a while, through the media system, all of us out here in audience land don't know who did what. Well, this documentary is about, did we ever go to the moon? We'll be introducing a guy named Bill Kaysing, and hopefully later a man by the name of Ralph Renee. They both believe we never went to the moon. We never landed a man on the moon. Now, how did I get to this point? You may, first thoughts that come into your mind, we never went to the moon, we never landed a guy on the moon? Well, that's ridiculous. I saw it on television. Well, I saw it on television too. I was 14 years old. I even bought me a little plastic model, put it together of the Apollo spacecraft and dangled it from the top of my bed and would watch it and look at it at night until I fell asleep, dreaming of being an astronaut. Well, anyway, as I studied astronomy and the solar system, and specifically what they call planetology, the study of planets, the planet's geography, volcanism, whether a planet is alive or dead, whether it has magma flow in it, volcanoes and stuff. And I got into all that, bought books on the subject, and then I got into space flight technology. That is an exciting subject. How do you get a man from planet Earth to Mars, moon? What difference it make? It's a long way. You got to breathe, eat. And how do you protect yourself from that horrible environment out there? It is a very deadly environment. One hole in the spacecraft and it's just like a jet plane, man. You're sucked out like a piece of spaghetti. Or it just explodes, blows apart. Because the tremendous vacuum out there sucks all the air out of it. Very volatile out there. Well, as I studied, digging around bookstores, I found a book, well, kind of a paperback, self-published, 8.5 by 11 book. We Never Went to the Moon by Bill Kaysing. I says, oh no, not another conspiracy or hoax or whatever. I says, look, I've studied planetology, I've studied space flight technology, and yeah, we went to the moon. This is ridiculous. I thumbed through it, looked through it, studied it. All of a sudden I got to thinking, this guy has some good arguments. Very good arguments. At least for somebody like myself. I knew more about the moon and Mars than I did how to get there at the time. So I began to write the government, NASA, the National Space Science Data Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, ordering photographs. I'd already been studying a guy named the late Glenn Stickland. Fred Stickland was his father, excuse me. Glenn is his son, who took over. This man says that the government's been kind of hiding a lot of truth from us, that the lunar surface isn't all that hostile, that there's more of an atmosphere than we're told. And he takes a different approach to the point that even aliens have been doing mining operations on the moon, and along with United States and the Soviet Union building bases on the backside of the moon, and there's a lot of other books on the subject out. But anyway, I added Bill Kaysing to my list of research, and I started adding more photographs to my NASA collection and scanning them through my computer, enhancing them, blowing them up, looking at them, and all this time studying Richard Hoagland as well. You don't know who Richard Hoagland is. He made the face on Mars famous in his Monuments of Mars book. And I studied him for a while, bought the entire collection of the USGS survey topographical maps of the moon. They're called photomosaic maps. And at the time I didn't know you could get it all from NASA, so I bought the paper, big fold-out map versions. Then I got it on CD-ROM, and I was studying Mars for a good while. And like I say, this led me to the moon. As I studied lunar geography and the science of what's in the moon, the surface of the moon, its atmosphere, I ran across Bill Casey as I was easing into spaceflight technology. How to build a spacecraft. What does it take to get to Earth to the moon, from here to Mars, and from here to another star? Well, I began to study Bill Casey's material and decided to call him. I says that we got some problems here. So I called him up. I says, Bill, I run a film company. I make documentaries. I would like to interview you. And we will meet him in a minute. He said, sure, I've been interviewed hundreds of times before. Come on up, shoot me. I says, well, I'll shoot you, but I'll do it with a camera. Just hope to God I get there before the government gets you. But anyway, I went up there and interviewed him, and I took some footage that you will be seeing, and he's going to discuss just exactly why all the scientific data that he's dug up on why we could have never landed a man on the moon. We will be showing and using photographic and scientific data. And he'll have some photographs of his own to show you, explaining certain things. So, let us go to Bill Casey. He's a pretty cool dude. I met him in person, and I think he's got a real good story to tell. And I'll get back with you after we get through with Bill Casey. I'm your host for this show. See you in a minute.
My name is Bill Casey. I'm a writer. I've been very interested in the Apollo project from the beginning, especially when I suspected that it was all a big hoax. Now, how did I happen to write a book? Well, that started because I was living on my boat in Oakland, and we had a bunch of homeless Vietnam veterans staying with us. One of the men was John Grant, who, when he was in Vietnam, became hooked on heroin. But beyond that, he had a tremendous animosity towards the U.S. government for what it had done to thousands of men, killed them, wounded them, changed their lives, made them drug addicts. John was an angry man, and he said to me one night, he said, Bill, why don't you expose the government, reveal it for what it is? Why don't you say something outrageous like, we never went to the moon? And I said, hey, that's a great idea. Why don't we just do that? We'll spoof the government. We'll get even with them. So I wrote an outline, sent it off to a publisher, got an immediate contract, and before long I was heavily involved in research, which you're about to see, regarding Apollo and the fact that it very well may never have happened. Now I'd like to show you the facts about We Never Went to the Moon in greater detail. The information I have is contained in these books, the first published in '74 and the latest in '91. I worked at the Propulsion Field Laboratory as a technical writer. When the first moon efforts took place, I questioned their authenticity. I made a list of my major doubts. Later on, the list was expanded. In fact, it was greatly expanded as I began to do intensive research into the Apollo project. As the books were sold throughout the world, the news media responded with numerous articles everyone wanted to know more about the alleged moon flights. These articles appeared in many publications, from tabloids to the New York Times. Finally, NASA had to create a rebuttal to my arguments, and this was sent out to the thousands of people who wrote NASA. Finally, a major tabloid featured my story in their front page edition, showing that many of the photos taken on the moon supported my contention that the moon landing was definitely a hoax. In my book, you'll find many interesting facts which I have gleaned from thousands of pages of NASA material. I've also been able to obtain a lot of pictures that ordinarily don't appear in the context of the Apollo hoax. I'm certain that you'll find this book of great interest, and it's available through Holy Terra Video. In all technical artists' renderings of space, stars are shown. Astronomers have described how awe-inspiring the views of the stars would be from the lunar surface, and yet in no photos allegedly taken on the moon are any stars visible. In this film clip from Destination Moon, you have seen how professional astronomers visualized the stars would appear to astronauts actually on the surface. But in no case did the Apollo astronauts comment on how beautiful the stars would appear. The lunar lander shown in this artist's rendering had a 10,000-pound thrust engine, which would have created a large crater beneath the lunar lander and scattered dust everywhere. It's strange that there is never a crater shown beneath any lunar lander, nor any dust on the pads, despite these prior artists' conceptions. Note here, no dust on the footpads of the lunar lander. The test vehicle for lunar landing never succeeded in training any astronaut. Instead, it became uncontrollable and nearly killed pilot Armstrong, shown parachuting to safety. If the test unit could not be controlled on Earth, how in the world could it be controlled in a totally alien environment? With no atmosphere, the glaring sun produces intense illumination or deep black shadows with nothing in between. The sun is directly behind this astronaut. Why isn't the front of his suit in deep shadow? If there were a light source, it would appear in his face shield. These same facts apply to this, the most famous shot of Buzz Aldrin allegedly standing on the moon. With the sun as the only supposed light source, how is it that the front of his suit is brightly illuminated? We can only conclude that this shot used a secondary light source which is not shown in his faceplate. And notice also that there are no stars visible in the black sky. The movie Star Wars utilized matte paintings which simulate backgrounds on far distant planets. It appears that the same technique was used to create many of the pictures supposedly taken on the moon. Notice in this and other views to follow that there is always a distinct line of demarcation between the foreground and the background. Note in this view particularly that there's a very detailed foreground, and yet the background has almost no detail at all, and of course no stars in the sky. Moon hoax investigator Charles Ellery recently measured the exit door of the LEM against the dimensions of the suited and backpacked astronaut and found that it would have been impossible to leave the lander while so equipped. We also see that a secondary light source was necessary to light up the exit door. Anyone who wishes to verify these facts can visit the Smithsonian Museum in Washington and see for themselves. NASA admits that the moon rocks contain minerals common to Earth, while several geologists have questioned the presence of glass, which requires oxygen. That gas is absent on the moon. Furthermore, NASA has a well-equipped ceramics lab which can manufacture any rock to order. NASA has never released photos showing the moon with respect to any other celestial body other than the Earth. The vast and virtually unpopulated state of Nevada was the ideal place to stage the Apollo simulation. Isolated and yet proximate to Las Vegas, the nuclear test site provided the Apollo simulation project with the most private photography possible. Circles indicate checkpoints where guards with submachine guns and armored cars prevent entry, especially to Area 51, where journalists are never permitted under any circumstances. In this view of one of the many hidden canyons on the nuclear test site Apollo simulation base, it may be seen how effective minimal security measures could be. No one could drive or walk into the facility without detection. Within the 1,600 square mile facility, once known as the nuclear test site and now called the Department of Energy base, are complete cities like Mercury. Here, the hardware needed for the Apollo hoax was probably fabricated. The dry lake below the foothills provided secret landing strips for the entry and exit of astronauts and other simulation personnel. Totally remote installations, such as this one near Area 51, contained the most complex settings for simulation photography. It was possible to create lunar backgrounds in the barren Nevada hills and mountains. Simulation staff sworn to secrecy as tight as the Manhattan Project occupied well-guarded planning and operations facilities. Who were the astronauts? Mainly trained pilots accustomed to taking orders from higher authority and thus ideal to carry out the simulation. Whether in a plane or a rocket, they carried out instructions without question. One astronaut, Gus Grissom, at left, was a maverick, however, who openly expressed doubts as to the feasibility of Apollo. Unfortunately, he did not live long enough to pursue his questioning. The Apollo 11 astronauts, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, performed the first simulation and were thus subjected to the greatest stresses. Their responses are understandable considering the tremendous pressures of being the leads in a global hoax. Aldrin suffered a nervous breakdown, and Armstrong has become a virtual recluse, refusing to discuss Apollo under any circumstances. In the film Return to Earth, based on Aldrin's book and starring Cliff Robertson, there is a scene which summarizes these facts. Apollo was preceded by a long history of failure. Rockets blew up on the ground and in the air. Apollo was preceded by a long history of failure. In my book are reproduced 3 pages from a much longer list of astronomical failures compiled by NASA. Is it logical that repeated blow-ups would be followed by 6 successful Apollo flights? In my many years of research of the Apollo simulation project, I've received numerous letters from people who agree with my concept. Here is a typical one. As the author says, quote, "I am in full sympathy with your opinion, and I have stated ever since 1969 that I did not believe that anyone had ever been to the moon, and it was simply a production put on in a studio somewhere, probably in South America. But your idea is even more interesting, that perhaps it was filmed right at NASA headquarters," unquote. No craters, no stars, numerous lighting anomalies, both of terrain and astronauts, dust where there shouldn't be dust, and no dust where there should be. This and an abundance of other evidence leads to the unshakable conviction that men have never landed on the moon.
It's an interesting line of arguments Bill Kaysing has there. This was his first tape he put out exposing the great Apollo hoax. But you know the government, you know the media. They got a hold of the tape, put it on television, put out a news broadcast, special edition, and supposedly ripped him to shreds. Well, Bill was watching that program, recorded it, and he came back, step by step, one argument at a time, and reversed it all right back into his lap, proving that we never put a man on the moon. Anyway, here's Bill Kaysing's arguments refuting NASA's arguments against his. See you in a minute.
Forward, drift into the right a little. Right, down a half.
30 seconds.
Forward, just. Right. Contact light. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
19 years ago today, 2 American men landed on the moon, and those moments, those pictures, have become part of the American mythology, indelibly imprinted in our minds, like the names of our last heroes, the astronauts themselves. But what if it never happened? What if NASA and some great gray unnamed bigwigs, faced with Soviet space success, a need to explain space expenditures, and God knows what all, conspired to fake the Apollo landings on the moon? What if they used Hollywood special effects and some mind-numbing, bald-faced lies to land the lunar module on a Nevada desert? A great plot for a conspiracy movie. In fact, they tried it. It was called Capricorn 1. But it was just a lot of entertaining hokum. Or was it? Bill Kaysing, South Bay author who wrote the infamous book We Never Landed on the Moon, says it was all a hoax because we needed a hoax, and we needed it kept secret.
If a conspiracy is important enough, it can be kept a deep, dark secret.
Kaysing, a man with a built-in smile, admits he didn't really believe his own theory at first.
I went to Las Vegas and I began researching, and suddenly I discovered a man by the name of Thomas Ronald Barron, who had testified before the Congressional Investigating Committee after the death of Grissom, Chafee, and White. Well, 2 weeks after he testified, he was found dead in his car. Now, when you're an investigative journalist, this really sends up the antenna. Somebody testified and then he's dead. So that, at first it was a farce, it was a spoof. But Thomas Ronald Barron got me really started.
The truth is that the Kaysing book is a lot of fun, if you take it slowly, analyzing each argument carefully, and for the signs the author was trying to fit his evidence to his theory rather than the other way around. It's a classic study in how faith becomes fact, how an author's natural mistrust of government, and bureaucracy in this case, becomes dark conspiracy. Examples. The astronauts didn't think the spacecraft would work, says Kaysing.
Morning that Gus Grissom went to his death, he went in the backyard and picked a lemon. And Betty Grissom said, "What are you going to do with that lemon?" And he says, "I'm going to hang it on the command module because that's what I think of it." Now, my theory is this, that Gus Grissom knew that Apollo wasn't going to work, and he was about to blow the whistle on the whole project. I'll say it flatly, Gus Grissom was murdered. Chaffee and White went with him.
For Bill, the charge of murder is enough, never mind the proof. Kaysing says there are more sinister signs.
In 1967, 8 astronauts died violently.
Kaysing implies that they were murdered to keep them silent about something they knew. But examination of those deaths show only the 3 tragic Apollo 1 deaths, another man who fell asleep at the wheel of his car, a test pilot dying in an experimental flight, and so on and so on, never a hint of darker ends. Kaysing's web of questions continues. He turns your head only if you fail to ask questions about his questions. Examples. Kaysing asks why the Soviets never landed on the moon. NASA, however, points out that they did land on the moon with far cheaper unmanned vehicles. Kaysing asks why Apollo's landing wasn't seen by Earth telescopes. Nice question, except that astronomers point out that even today's telescopes would be unable to pick up such activity. Kaysing asks why stars are not seen in moon photos. Every photographer we talked to said available light would disperse the distant stars into dim gray or black light. Then there is the lander itself.
I have pictures right here which I can show you. In fact, we can present them, showing NASA drawings of a crater underneath the lunar lander. Now, if they anticipated a crater with all of their scientific foreknowledge, why is it that they now say, oh, well, you know, no craters, you know?
But the experts and the evidence show clearly that Apollo landed on a relatively dry, dust-free bedrock area. What's more, the lander needed only a fraction of its potential emergency thrust in the near-zero moon gravity.
I think it's like a lot of things that are omissions or anomalies in the entire Apollo hoax. They couldn't do it technically correct.
It's probably true that for author Kaysing, the pursuit of the conspiracy is what fascinates. He collects anything that fits his thesis.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
There's a lot of that you can take several half-truths and reach very rapidly an erroneous conclusion.
Specifically, there's no crater under the lunar module because except for a thin layer of dust, the moon is made of rock.
Not true, as this photo proves. The Apollo astronauts' foot sank 2 inches deep into the dusty surface.
As for the shadows and reflections,
The visor is basically a mirror, and with the sun coming in from behind the astronaut, anything that the astronaut is facing is going to be illuminated by the sun and reflected in the mirror.
In this famous view of Colonel Aldrin allegedly standing on the moon, we see that the front of his suit is illuminated. If this were really shot on the moon, the front of his suit would be just as black as the small gully at his feet.
finally, there is also good reason for the absence of stars in photos sent back from the moon.
The Earth is very bright, and the lunar surface is very bright. So the stars are faded out because of you don't want these overexposed.
Every picture that NASA has presented of the heavens shows stars, and yet in all of the Apollo landings, the astronauts never discuss stars, nor do we ever see photographs of stars, although they could have easily taken them with a simple astronomical telescope camera.
Somehow, an electrical fire ignited in their command module, and all three were dead within moments.
This is typical of the lies disseminated by NASA. In the book Liftoff is this quote: "The crew had no chance to escape, but died of smoke inhalation and burns within moments." This statement is refuted in the book Mission to the Moon, a critical examination of NASA and the space program, in which this quote appears. NASA was forced to correct earlier statements that the astronauts had died quickly, silently, and painlessly.
Kaysing asks why the Soviets never landed on the moon. NASA, however, points out that they did land on the moon with far cheaper unmanned vehicles.
Lloyd Mallon, an expert in aerospace technology, wrote an entire book called Russia's Space Hoax, documented proof that the Soviet space program has been faked.
Kaysing asked why Apollo's landing wasn't seen by Earth telescopes. Nice question, except that astronomers point out that even today's telescopes would be unable to pick up such activity.
In a recent experiment, 90 2-foot square mirrors were placed on a desert location in California. This photograph was shot from space by a NASA satellite Landsat 2. Why was not something similar done on the moon? A lightweight reflective mylar or tinfoil could have been used and achieved the same results and would have been visible by even a small telescope. In 1967, 8 astronauts died violently.
Kaysing implies that they were murdered to keep them silent about something they knew. But examination of those deaths show only the 3 tragic Apollo 1 deaths, another man who fell asleep at the wheel of his car, a test pilot dying in an experimental flight, and so on and so on. Never a hint of darker ends.
In the book, The Making of an Ex-Astronaut by Brian O'Leary, we quote, "Williams was the 8th astronaut to die in an accident. 8 out of about 50 astronauts during 2 years is pretty grim statistics. 4 were in T-38s. Theodore Freeman had been killed by a goose who flew into his cockpit when he was flying near Ellington Air Force Base. Elliot See and Charles Bassett were together in a T-38 when they flew into a building during an instrument approach, and Ed Givens was killed in a 1-car accident on his way home. That leaves the 3 who were burned to death by fire in an Apollo capsule at Cape Kennedy: Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. Was Shepard rewarded for his adroit airmanship by being given a Coors distributorship? Are these 3 of the best liars in America? Neil Armstrong will no longer grant interviews for any reason from anyone. He has retained this silence now for the past 10 years. There are other books on the subject. This one, Did Man Land on the Moon, by James Craney, examines the project from a very interesting mathematical and engineering standpoint. In this series of 3 photographs, we see a curious anomaly. The foreground and the background seem to be sharply delineated. Could it be that these were shot in a Hollywood or perhaps Nevada studio? The film Capricorn 1 has a strange history. It was begun at the same time that another group planned to film We Never Went to the Moon. It is altogether possible that Capricorn 1 was made to draw the fire from the much more revealing We Never Went to the Moon film. Where was the space hoax filmed? That's easy. There is a huge government test facility northwest of Las Vegas, once called the Nuclear Test Site. Here, under heavy guard, anything could take place, specifically the filming of all of the photographs used for the We Never Went to the Moon hoax.
In this photograph, taken at the Rocketdyne Propulsion Field Laboratory, you are seeing the exhaust gas jet from a hypergolic rocket engine. Note that this gas is totally opaque. No way could you see even a half an inch into or through this gas. It is that opaque. This gas is composed of 2 propellants, nitrogen tetroxide and UDMH, or unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine. The first is the oxidizer, the second is the fuel. When they are mixed, they ignite spontaneously. That's why they get the name hypergolic. They are propellants that burn on contact, and they were used to simplify the engine so that it would not need an igniter.
But there's just one tremendous problem, and it's seen in the next film clip. What you will watch is, or what you are watching now, is the alleged takeoff of the lunar ascender vehicle on Apollo 17. But there's just one problem. No gas, no opacity, nothing. In fact, nothing is seen coming out of the ascending engine. Now, astronauts, explain that one away. I found in many instances that Rocketdyne did not tell the truth about various basic facts. For example, I worked for a while on a rocket engine test seal, and all of the information about this seal was misrepresented. Well, I decided I didn't want to be a part of it, so I wrote the true story about this seal, and I submitted it to the Air Force. Well, believe me, the material hit the fan, and I was called on the carpet and told, don't submit material without checking with your superiors. And I said, well, this was the absolute truth, and I wanted the truth to go through. Well, nothing came of it as far as I was concerned, but I learned that large companies have no scruples whatsoever about lying regarding important data. And I would say that maybe that was the genesis of my suspicions about Apollo. But I had a number of other incidents occur that told me that big companies say what they want and not necessarily what is true. I worked for Rocketdyne from 1957 to 1963, February 57 to June 1963. So the period of time, 57 to 63, encompasses Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and especially what I worked on a lot was Atlas. So I'm very familiar with high-powered liquid propellant rocket engines. But as head of the research department at the Santa Susana Research Facility Laboratory, a 1,200-acre facility above the San Fernando Valley, I had a gray badge and I had a Q clearance. Well, with those two items, I could go anywhere in the base and talk to anybody about anything. I had total freedom and liberty. And as a result, I learned a lot about the company and about what they were doing that very few other people had the opportunity of learning. And that's why when this challenge came up from John Grant to blow the whistle on the government, I thought, well, I've been chosen. This is an assignment for me in my life. And so I've been working on it for the last 21 years, and as I've said several times on the air, that I intend to work on it until I'm successful or die in the attempt. A lot of the Apollo work was going on while I was still there. For example, the creation of the giant Saturn V engines. These engines were so big that they transferred the whole project up to Edwards Air Force Base. See, a lot of what we saw was legitimate. Nobody denies that the Saturn V, all 6 of them took off. All 7 of them if you include Apollo 13. Nobody will deny that because a lot of people saw it, and I certainly don't deny it. But that's where they spent their money. They spent their money on getting something that weighed as much as a U.S. destroyer off the ground and out of sight. Apollos 1 through 6 were all failures, dreadful failures. They blew up on the pad. They blew up 50 feet in the air. Apollo 6, the last one in which I think we have truthful data, was was a total fiasco. It took off. Second stage didn't ignite. Everything went wrong that could go wrong. It's mentioned in my book. It's one of the items. So I'm very glad you answered the question. From Apollo 7 on, they decided to falsify information, and that's what they did. They didn't tell anybody what happened to anything. See, things began disappearing as Apollo 11 approached. In other words, things that should have been obvious and manifest and exposed just weren't there anymore.
For example,
walks in space, for example. How do we know that these walks in space actually took place, or were they fake, just like the Mike Collins gravity shot? See, a fellow from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a brilliant engineer, once read my book, and he said, Bill, he says, not only do I believe your story, because it makes a lot of sense, he says, I think I know the group of men who put together the simulation. In other words, made it as powerful and as believable as they could. And these are men with a group called the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, and they are essentially an MIT group. They have all the information that could possibly be made available to them, so as for them to be able to create a logical simulation. Now, the one thing that they couldn't simulate, because too many astronomy buffs would have found them out, and that is the stars. And they decided, okay, we'll just stonewall it as far as stars are concerned. We won't talk about them, we won't photograph them, we will ask the astronauts never to discuss them, which my friend Ralph Rene points out so clearly, that there's been a complete silence. That's the true word. There's been a complete silence as far as astronauts and stars, and when there are casual mentions of them, they're very transient and very peripheral, not very revealing. You don't need an atmosphere to work as a lens. Stars would come through very clearly. See, star pictures have been taken in space, but they aren't particularly publicized. Early stratospheric plane pilots said that when they got up around 100,000 feet, they could plainly see stars. During the day, if you get down inside of a 100-foot well and shut out all sunlight, you can see stars. So the stars are up there and they're plainly visible. And certainly every night you have a great opportunity. Just go outside and put your head up. So I asked an astronomer one time from the University of California here in Santa Cruz, I said, what would stars have appeared like to an astronaut on the moon had they gone? And he said, the star picture would have been unbelievable. There would have been trillions and billions and quadrillions of stars. The whole sky would have been bright with stars. It would have been like standing on the top of Mount Whitney on a moonless night and looking straight up. In other words, the sight of the celestial heavens from the surface of the moon would have been absolutely breathtaking. And that, of course, brings up the point. Why is it when Armstrong and Aldrin jumped out of their lunar lander, why didn't they look up and say, my God, I don't believe it. Look at the stars. Not a mention. If I didn't have a single argument other than the stars, I would rest my case on it.
Ralph Rene, your friend, mentioned that Collins slipped in one of the quotes in his book. He pulled out a quote that Collins said when they were going around the dark side of the moon, which at that summertime was really dark. They said the only way you could tell where the moon was the black orb that it cast against the beautiful sky star pattern.
Yeah, he did make a mistake. Yeah, this sort of stuff, you know, sort of proves that little leaks do occur, and just enough to whet our appetites for the real truth. You know, that brings up one other point. There is a method of lie detection called PSE, psychological stress evaluation. And apparently, if a person lies, it ties up his vocal cords. Now, what I've always wanted to do is get an astronaut to answer some of these questions, like about stars, and then analyze his voice using psychological stress evaluation. To my knowledge, this has never been done, but it should be done. They held a meeting one time, I think I mentioned this in the book, in Las Vegas, and they would not discuss Apollo at all, even though they were there for an anniversary of it. Bob Stoldahl, who was news director at KLAS in Las Vegas, is a good source of information on that. He's now with television in Nashville. So you see, I might say that I have a lot of backup people that have witnessed, observed, and studied the same material I have, and agree with me most emphatically. Well, if they're visible from Earth on a nice moonless night, isn't it logical that they're visible from, and in fact, they're visible where there's a near vacuum. In other words, Mount Whitney is almost 15,000 feet high, almost 3 miles high. So when you get up that high, there's very little atmosphere. There's almost no oxygen left. A lot of people have to take, breathing equipment along to survive. So what we're saying is that the top of Mount Whitney or Everest or any high mountain is a replica of standing on the surface of the moon. In other words, a near perfect vacuum and an extremely clear atmosphere. That's why the astronomer told me, he had a PhD candidacy in astronomy, and he said, Bill, that's what the astronomer would have seen had he gone to the moon. And of course, in that George Pal sequence, George Pal has the sky full of stars. You know, I just thought of a little supplemental bit of information that's pretty valuable. Until it closed recently, Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino, California, had the world's largest motion picture studio, the largest sound stages, more cameras, more equipment, more of everything than all of the movie studios put together. And this is the result of a newspaper article about Norton. And so it's quite obvious that if they wanted to shoot anything, all they had to do was go to Norton, and they had complete security. Because nobody gets in or out of Norton without a pass. At least if they value their lives. And of course, this same secrecy is invoked in Area 51 in the northeast corner of the nuclear test site in Nevada, an area that has become of great interest to not only Apollo hoaxers, but a lot of other people too that are interested in extraterrestrial people and all kinds of strange vehicles that might have come to Earth and then suddenly disappeared. So you see, actually, there's a lot of mysteries out there. Apollo is just one of many. When you think about all of the things that the government has withheld from us, how Robert McNamara in a recent book confesses that he was wrong and that he also lied. In a recent book, he confesses that he was completely wrong and that he did lie about the entire Vietnam project. And as a result, thousands of men died due to these lies. So, as I always sort of summarize and bottom line it, it turns out the U.S. government has become our enemy number one, and we better look out for ourselves and not take anything the government says as truth. No, a lot of things are happening that I believe the government are perpetrating in order to make certain things believable. But they're lies, they're falsehoods, they're misrepresentations, and we should watch the government very, very closely from now on. They are not to be trusted. Doubt everything that you read in what I call the conventional orthodox media, because that media is essentially owned by the government, and they can put anything they want in there. Any deceit or lies or misrepresentations can go into Time and Newsweek and any of the newspapers, and on television also. I often consider that the newsmen and women on television are nothing but shills for the biggest con game that was ever operated in the history of the world. And that's what they come out and say every night, is things that the establishment wants them to say. Very few people are aware that space is full of micrometeorites traveling up to 30,000 miles an hour. So these micrometeorites could be like the head of a pin, or they could be very large. You know, they could be as big as the state of Texas. There's a lot of stuff floating around in space. So what I've often wondered is how they could load 3 men into a command capsule and send them out into space and not expect some of these micrometeorites to go ripping right through this fairly thin structure. There was no steel because they had to be very careful about weight. So everything was made very, very lightweight, and of course insulated, hopefully against the heat and so forth. My friend Ralph Rene brings out a lot of details on structures, and particularly what he covers so effectively is the fact that there was really no way to protect astronauts from solar radiation, cosmic radiation, and of course the heat that is generated in space. Space isn't cold, it's hot.
And the micrometeorites.
Yeah, and the micrometeorites. Yeah, and of course walking around on the moon, they could have been rained on by micrometeorites. I have a feeling that even Surveyor could be a fake. Wouldn't be difficult, you know, to have a prop like the Surveyor and pretend that it got to the moon. One of the most absurd things is where I forget, Apollo 14 or 15, they land next to the Surveyor within, you know, a few hundred yards. I had to laugh at that, as much as I had to laugh at Shepard somehow or other taking a golf club with him, as though there were no security with Apollo. How could he actually smuggle a golf, I think it was a 7 or an 8 iron, how could he smuggle a heavy golf club and a ball, I think several balls, into the command module and carry it all the way to the moon with sort of the laughing approval of NASA? This is so ridiculous, outrageous, and absurd, where he puts the ball on the lunar surface and then hits it. Oh, save us from abject absurdities. Photographs and any video or film. And this is all available for practically nothing. NASA has libraries open to the public. This is how I became involved. I went to Las Vegas and went through the NASA Aeronautical and Space Library. And of course, as I mentioned in my book, what stopped me cold was the realization that Thomas Ronald Barron died mysteriously only a few days after he testified before Congress. I talked to Mae Brussel, who is the late Mae Brussel, and she told me personally, she says, Bill, there's always a puzzlement that becomes quite revealing if you can match a witness and his subsequent death. She says it happened with Kennedy. 18 people were killed not long after Kennedy's assassination. And the odds against it were like 2 or 3 trillion to 1. So when you have a witness and they die pretty soon, you've got something to investigate. And of course I hired a private eye to check on Barron, found out that he was cremated rather quickly after there was no investigation of his death to speak of. They just assumed it was an accident. There was no autopsy. In other words, he died under very mysterious circumstances.
I've got that letter.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
He's the one that wrote that statement about the problem with what was it, oxygen chambers, or what was it?
Well, he wrote a 500-page report, which has never been found, but he wrote a summary of it, a 50-page report, which I have. Senator Alan Cranston was able to get a copy, and I have perhaps one of the few copies owned by private citizens.
And that's published in your book?
I abstracted some of the material and put quite a bit of it in the book, because I felt that it was very important to see the exact status of Apollo before Grissom, Chafee, and White were burned to death.
In the Apollo...
the Apollo fire on January 27th, 1967.
That was, what number Apollo was that?
That would have been called Apollo 10. It was the one that preceded 11.
Ah.
In other words, 10 was supposed to be the Armstrong-Aldrin flight, but it never took place. Here we have the ascent vehicle of Apollo 17. What I would like viewers to do is to observe that there is no jet appearing below the ascent engine, although there certainly should be. I'd like to comment on something very curious. In 2 films, Oh Lucky Man with Malcolm McDowell and Diamonds Are Forever with Sean Connery, there are Apollo sets. Now, exactly what these sets signify or represent or mean in the context of the Apollo hoax, I am not certain, but it is certainly worth anyone's time to rent these films and to check out these Apollo sets that are unfailingly accurate and yet have no apparent meaning with reference to the film in which they appear. So it's a sort of a wheels within wheels, mystery within mystery, but it's certainly, if you're interested in pursuing the Apollo hoax, it's certainly worthwhile to check these out. I'd like to say a few words about Neil Armstrong, the man who allegedly set foot on the moon first. Neil Armstrong is a very strange individual. After he allegedly returned from the moon, he gradually became more and more reclusive. Today, he will not talk about Apollo with anybody under any circumstances. Recently, a friend of mine from Nashville, Tennessee, drove up to where Neil Armstrong lives in the rural section of Ohio, and tried to find him. No luck. He finally did find that Neil has a home somewhere in Cincinnati, but his neighbors don't know him. He doesn't publicize himself. He is essentially, you might call him a technological hermit. He's a man who knows all the answers, but he isn't talking. And one must ask the inevitable question, why? Why is this man, one of the most famous people of the 20th century, silent? I think his silence is most eloquent. I predicted that there would be a big event, something to which I could attach the moon film, the moon concept. And what happened was the release of a motion picture called JFK. It's in the theaters right now. People are flocking to see it. Talk radio is alive with it, and I just saw a Geraldo show in which they took a sort of a continuity on JFK and presented a group of people who claim without any reservations that Lyndon Baines Johnson was either the main instigator or one of the instigators of the assassination of Jack Kennedy. Now this is really heavy material, and I really believe this, that what has happened with the release of JFK, the event that I was predicting and looking for, is that there's going to be an explosion of exposés in the United States. Everybody who has some truth to tell is going to get up and tell it. And that's why I've added this appendix to my moon tape, to add some interesting aspects that relate to the whole subterfuge, the deceit, the duplicity that's gone on in the United States for as long as I've been alive, and of course much longer, and would continue if something weren't done about it. I recommend that you go see the movie JFK, directed by Oliver Stone and starring Kevin Costner as Jim Garrison, the District Attorney of New Orleans. In the film, they very carefully, methodically, and logically bring out the facts of the assassination, that what occurred was not what the Warren Commission claimed occurred, that there was a sole assassin. Instead, there was definitely a conspiracy of oil men, of the CIA, possibly of the mafia, and in the recent Geraldo program, the fact that Lyndon Baines Johnson himself could have been the prime instigator of the assassination. Now this film, I feel, really is a breakthrough that everyone should see as soon as possible and take their future actions and cues from what it presents. In one dynamic scene, Jim Garrison says, "The country is in danger when people are afraid to speak the truth." Well, I think we're now entering an era where there's no need to be afraid any longer, because the people are going to rise up and say, hey, we're sick of the lies that the establishment, the military complex, military-industrial complex, and all of these other corporate hierarchy has foisted on the public to mislead them. So my main point is really not about Moon, not about JFK. What it really is about government lies. The government has lied to us as long as I personally can remember. I remember back just before I went into the U.S. Navy in World War II, how the newspapers told us that Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack. Well, I can say, based on my own associations with the U.S. Navy, with men who were at Pearl Harbor, with my studies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that there is no question in my mind that not only did Roosevelt know that the attack was going to take place and let it take place, he actually engineered it. He created Pearl Harbor. There are many books now on this subject. And go to your bookstore and get some of these books and read them, and you'll see that one of the basic premises of our whole history is false. The Japanese did not surprise us. The people in Washington knew full well what was going to happen, and they let 3,000 men die to be killed by the Japanese because they wanted to get the United States involved in a war through which they would make heavy profits. Now, the same thing occurred with Jack Kennedy. Just prior to his assassination, he had signed an order to withdraw all of the troops from Vietnam. Few people are aware of this fact, but that was one of the main reasons why Kennedy was assassinated. The military-industrial complex, aided by men, can we call him that, by traitors like Lyndon Baines Johnson, conspired to get rid of Kennedy so that they could go ahead and create a war in which they would make billions of dollars of profits, kill over 50,000 American men and over 2 million Asians. It was the worst event of our history, and it was all brought about through lies, deceit, and duplicity. And there again, that's why I say it's so important for everyone to seek the truth, and when you know the truth, to tell the truth. I think that you'll find a lot of information on JFK coming into the media. I think we've reached a point in time where neither the establishment nor the population can ignore this basic fraud that was perpetrated on America. And because the truth of JFK and his assassination is going to come out in full detail, I believe that from here on out in the 90s, we're going to have tributaries of information swarming into a river of truth. And that is what we're going to see coming up from here on out. Now, my own book, We Never Went to the Moon, is a shocker to most people. I've been called a communist, a traitor. I've had death threats because I've written this book. But my feeling is that I'm going to tell the truth, though the heavens will crack. Because I, like Jim Garrison, believe that the country is in danger when people are afraid to tell the truth. Now, right or wrong, I've presented a lot of material in this book that is worthy of your consideration. We reviewed it in the tape which you just saw. There are essentially 3 editions of We Never Went to the Moon. The first one was printed almost like a little booklet by Eden Press. We have no records of the number of sales of this book. We never received any royalties for it, other than a small advance. And all in all, the history of this particular copy or edition is a great mystery. An even greater mystery is the second edition, which was published by Desert Publications in Cornville, Arizona. I have no knowledge whatsoever of how many copies they printed, how well it sold. I even went to Cornville one time to track down Desert Publications staff, and I could find no one. Even the fire department couldn't tell me where they moved to or anything about them. Well, to eliminate the mystery of We Never Went to the Moon, what I've done is I've made a set of running copies for a Xerox machine. Now there's no way, at least no honest, legitimate way of stopping the publication of the updated second edition of the book. If you want a copy, just write to the address which is given in this film, and we'll see that you're put in touch with the right department. So now we can talk about the book because we have complete control of it, and no publishers can hide copies or run for it or whatever they want to do. We're in charge now.
Hello. Interesting subject, isn't it? Did we go to the moon or not? Well, we have Bill Kaysing saying we never did. We never landed a man on the moon. We have a lot of NASA arguments. People in the government says we did. The media is in a toss-up. They just use the information as sensationalism for their media programs and news broadcasts. They like to chop to shreds anybody that has a different viewpoint. Well, you know, this brings up the subject again of there's three things, the way the mind works. I believe, I think, and I know. A lot of people believe we went to the moon, landed a man on the moon. A lot of people believe we didn't. A lot of people think, meaning they have more data. Bill Kaysing says he thinks we didn't. He believes we didn't. He thinks we didn't. But does he know? Does anybody know? If you haven't been there, walked on the moon, you can't know. Know means experience. The only ones that really know are the astronauts.